Welcome everybody to this event that we're hosting this morning, a pivot to Asia, question mark, NATO at 71. My name is Julie Smith and I'm the director of the Asia program and the Geopolitics program at the German Marshall Fund. This event today is going to dig into a subject that may have once been unimaginable for the NATO crowd to sit and discuss China as a transatlantic issue and topic. But China has become part of the transatlantic conversation inside the NATO Alliance in recent months and years. We've had a couple of really interesting developments as it pertains to the alliance in China. We had NATO actually conducting its very first China review last year in 2019, and mention of that review appeared in the communique that was issued at the Leaders Summit late last year. Additionally, in recent weeks, we've seen the NATO Secretary General launch a reflection process that will touch on some of the challenges in Asia and the challenges associated with China's rise in particular, as well as China's investments in Europe, particularly in the area of critical infrastructure. We also heard from the NATO Secretary General recently. He joined both the Atlantic Council and the German Marshall Fund in a virtual event where he rolled out his vision for NATO in 2030. And as he issued some of his ideas to enhance NATO's ability to operate globally, to remain remain united and strengthen political unity and strengthen military capabilities, you saw an emphasis on the Pacific in that presentation. So what we've done is we've brought together three terrific contributors and speakers to this discussion today. We've got Fabrice Pothier, who is joining us from the other side of the Atlantic in Spain. Many of you know him. He is the former head of policy planning at the NATO Alliance. He also has an affiliation with IISS in London, where he is a senior fellow in the Defense Policy and Strategy program. And he is joined by Ian Brzezinski. Many of you know him as well from his former role as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy at the Pentagon. But now he is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Very pleased to have him from here in Washington, providing the US perspective. And particularly thrilled that we were able to get Yoko Iwama to join us from Tokyo, from Japan, at a very late hour. We're so appreciative of your willingness to do this. She is a professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, very excited to get a perspective from across the Pacific. So this is, in my mind, the perfect group to dive in. So without further introduction, I'm going to go ahead and just launch into a moderated conversation with these three experts for about 20 or 30 minutes. And then what we'd like to give all of you the chance to do is to submit your own questions below in the Q&A box. You can message us and I will be cycling through those questions and feeding them back to our three panelists. So again, thanks for joining us today. And without further ado, I'm just gonna launch right in. So welcome to all of you. So Fabrice, why don't I start with you on the other side of the Atlantic and maybe get some insight and perspective from you. Let's start with this China review that was undertaken. The review, as I understand it, is actually classified, but folks have been discussing on the margins, you know, why this happened, why NATO decided to do this, what the purpose of it was, why we decided or NATO decided to do this right now, and what folks believe kind of ultimately came out of it. Could you give us some sense of kind of how NATO has decided to take on the China challenge? And I guess the second part of it is some have felt that the EU has been a little bit ahead of the game. kind of has been working on the China challenge also for some time now, came out last year and called China a systemic rival. NATO hasn't quite gone that far, but do you feel that now the movement in Brussels inside both institutions signals a real sea change as it pertains to the transatlantic security environment and China?
Thanks a lot, Julie, and great to be with you and friends from the other side of the Atlantic and also from Japan. Lots of important questions you just raised, so we try to be concise. And to answer your first question on the why, I think the factual why was a request from the US Secretary of State at the foreign ministerial that took place in Washington back a year and a half ago, putting China on the agenda and asking the NATO allies to look into the matter and basically answer the simple question of what does China mean for an alliance like NATO? But let me give you also a piece of context, which actually China came up on the NATO agenda now almost 8 years ago. And that was a result of the Obama Asia pivot. And I was at NATO at the time, and there were two reactions. The first one was traumatic. For the European allies, it's like, oh, we are going to lose the US yet again. They are shifting away from the good old European continent. But the second phase of the reaction was actually started to be more constructive, which is to say, what does China mean for Europe from a strategic point of view, not just as a trade partner? And I was at NATO and I started making the point that if NATO doesn't go to China, China is already coming to NATO. China is a force to reckon with, civilian, but also increasingly military, in some broader areas of operation of the alliance, in the wider Middle East, in the Mediterranean, and increasingly the Arctic. And that point was started to get traction. And then Vladimir Putin decided to wage war against Ukraine, and NATO's kind of completely shifted focus back to, in a way, where it was some decades ago. So that's the piece of context that shows that, yes, it's coming from this US administration, but there was already a China seed that had been planted at NATO, I would say, back a few years ago. What's the purpose? I think the purpose is the point of saying, what does China mean for an alliance whose purpose is to protect its allies within a certain area, which is basically the northern Atlantic part, so the United States, Canada, and Europe. And given that China is becoming increasingly a global power, not just on the economic front, but on many other fronts, it has an implication also on the broader European security. In terms of outcome, I would say I would put three baskets. And like you, I have not seen the classified document, but I've obviously heard of, and I've discussed that with senior officials from capitals, but also from the NATO headquarters. The first basket is, I would say, a political one. And I think, first, the review is useful in itself because it allows to show that NATO is useful to the United States and to this US administration agenda. And that should not be underestimated. Second, it's useful because it reinforces the Western cohesion towards what is clearly and a well-established, a big new challenge that we're all facing, which is how do we deal with such a new global power? And thirdly, and this is a bit more between the lines, for some European allies, actually the China review at NATO was useful to put pressure on other European allies. As usual, they were using the US as the bogeyman to kind of do and say what otherwise they will not be capable of doing. And I know that, for example, my own country was, in a way, happy to see the review going on at NATO because it impressed an extra pressure on other allies who are actually more dependent technologically, financially from China, and not always willing to go all the way to address that. And finally, and this is also because we have our friend from Japan, I think it was also a way to find, to reconnect with some very close partners that with whom we developed relationship during the ISAF operation, Australia, New Zealand, but also Japan and South Korea, who politically were quite involved in the ISAF operation in Afghanistan. And since the end of ISAF, was always difficult to say, you know, where do we go next with that group of like-minded Indo-Pacific countries? And I think the China review also allowed to reconnect with them. And finally, on the political basket, don't forget that we have two major Pacific countries who are NATO allies, Canada and the United States, and two other European allies, the United Kingdom and France, who have territories in the Pacific and who have a real military presence. So I think it's not as if NATO was totally geographically or geopolitically disconnected. Finally, second basket, and I will be brief, the technological one. I think, you know, there has been, I would say, a growing awareness across Western capitals of the technological economic dependence that has been basically built over years vis-a-vis Chinese companies. To give you a few figures, since 2008, Chinese investments in Europe have gone tenfold. China has also gone up in the terms of what they buy in terms of companies. It's not just big infrastructure company, but it's increasingly high-tech companies like robotic companies in Germany, but many others. And therefore, there is a growing awareness that indeed there is a technological race here going on, and we should not be naive about it. And I know that a lot of capitals, because of the China review and because of the conversation in the European Union, started their own China review nationally, looking at what's our exposure to Chinese technology, Chinese investment, Chinese infrastructure in terms of what we can do as sovereign nations. So there is also that dimension of resilience and independence that the review was about. And I understand that one concrete outcome, and this is interesting, the senior NATO military staff have been given a sort of mandate to be able to give green or red cards to those countries, to the NATO allies, using capabilities that might have posed some risks in terms of interoperability and technology because of their connection to Chinese technology. So I think this actually is a very technical aspect, but a very useful one when we know what NATO is about. NATO is about the interoperability between allies and the capacity to work with systems that are safe and resilient. And the fact that the NATO military leadership has been given a role to be kind of checking the sanity check of the capabilities and the technology used by the allies is actually a useful concrete outcome. And finally, I think there's an operational dimension to the China review, which is, like I said, indeed, NATO is not present in the Indo-Pacific per se. I think it's not an option yet that NATO, the NATO flag flies in freedom of navigation operations in the Indo-Pacific theater. Some NATO allies are present, but are also keen on keeping it that way, keeping it bilateral or in small grouping rather than under a NATO flag. However, China is increasingly present in Africa, in the Persian Gulf. It's the first customer of Persian oil and gas, and also in the Mediterranean and in the Arctic. So in that sense, I think the fact that now NATO and the NATO military staff can factor in the China factor in any kind of planning and operation is useful. And finally, cyber is a major domain of operation, and China is a major actor in that domain, and cyber knows no boundaries and no geography. And here NATO, which claims to actually get its cyber policy to give it a bit more muscles, I would say, also needs to factor in the China dimension if it wants to have, I would say, a credible cyber posture.
Great. Well, that was a fabulous overview, very comprehensive. Thanks for those insights, and thanks for outlining the three separate baskets. There's a lot to dig into there, which we'll get to in the Q&A. Ian, I'm going to come to you next because as Fabrice opened up, he talked about the fact that it was the US administration, the State Department, that has really put pressure on the alliance to conduct this review. Can you help us set the table and help the folks listening on either across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, and other corners of the alliance, up in Canada, wherever, understand what's going on right now in terms of Europe, the United States, and China. We've just seen a flurry of visits. We had O'Brien, our national security advisor, deputy national security advisor, Pompeo, Secretary Pompeo traveling to Europe. Give us a sense of what's happening right now in this space of kind of Europe, China, and the United States, and kind of how you see this unfolding going forward. And is this a Trump administration priority? How do you view this across the political aisle? Help us understand the debates, or our guests understand some of the debates going on here as it pertains to NATO and China.
Julie, well, let me start by thanking you for organizing this and all you've done on behalf of the Transatlantic community and Transatlantic Alliance. You've been a force on this, and it's a real pleasure to be on a panel that you're moderating. It's great to see Fabrice, and it's a real pleasure to be introduced to Yoko. You know, on China, I don't think there's really, quote unquote, too much debate on what's at stake. And I would say that is a consensus that is bipartisan in the United States and increasingly transatlantic. You know, the NATO Secretary General likes to say that China is coming closer to us, closer to NATO. And Fabrice noted Chinese military exercises in the Arctic and the Mediterranean, infrastructure investments by Chinese companies across Europe, its activity in the cyberspace, constructive and unconstructive. So China has come to NATO. And I would add that, you know, this is not a surprise in a globalized world where we're increasingly interconnected and regional differentiations and distance are becoming less and less distinct and less far. We're coming closer and closer together. So it's not surprising that when you have a rising power like China, you would be feeling its presence. The problem we have, and I think there's growing consensus around this, and certainly there's a bipartisan consensus, is that there's a recognition that China is presenting a challenge, a full spectrum challenge of the like we've not seen since the former Soviet Union, and probably a more complex and more daunting challenge. It's got a $14 trillion economy that's using an aggressive predatory fashion, boycotts against countries in Europe and across Asia, leveraging its debt instruments against poor countries, buying up critical infrastructure that raises the concerns of our NATO commanders. Fabrice noted it's a technological threat to the West. China's a leader in 5G, artificial intelligence, hypersonics, quantum computing, and it's using these technologies on a daily basis via espionage and disinformation campaigns in ways that are affecting daily life of all NATO allies. There's recognition that China has growing military reach and is exercising that reach globally. $260 billion Chinese budget really translates into something about equivalent to 3/4 of the US defense budget in terms of purchasing power capability. Cooperation with Russia. Military is the pointy end of the spear that China uses to kind of undercut the rules-based, order. And it's an ideological challenge to the West and our practice of liberal democracy. China is using all its power to promote its version of national authoritarianism. I think this reality is something that's understood across both parties in the United States. I mean, if you look at the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, there's complete consensus on the Hill between the Republican and Democratic Party. And I think each of the points I made about China are recognized increasingly across European governments. The problem that we have is we don't have a comprehensive Western strategy to deal with this. And that's what we have to work on. And that's where I think NATO can actually play an important role. It can be a catalyst. It can't be a solution by itself, but it can help catalyze a transatlantic strategy. And the NATO role in that strategy could be to foster awareness of what China's up to, what it's doing, and how it's doing. It can also develop a transatlantic security strategy and posture for China, both to develop a cooperative relationship with China in political military affairs, but also to serve as a means to dissuade China from undermining transatlantic interests. And of course, using its institutions and its member states, it can facilitate the security component of a Western strategy dealing with China, including the tasks of engagement, deterrence, and defense.
Great, thanks, Ian. That's terrific, and definitely with you on the bipartisan consensus on the broad nature of the challenge. Without a doubt, there's not a lot of bipartisanship these days in this town, but I think this area is one space where, of course, there will be disagreements on the margins, but I'm with you. I think there is quite a bit of bipartisanship there. Yoko, perspectives from Japan. Very curious how folks in Tokyo, across Japan, have been observing this change inside the NATO alliance. This is a challenge that Japan has had to live with for quite some time. There's a lot we can learn from our friends in Japan as it relates to managing a relationship with China. Was there some enthusiasm for this review inside the NATO alliance, some skepticism that maybe it wouldn't do or say enough, that it was checking a box of some kind? And what are expectations going forward? Does Japan feel like it is being heard inside the NATO alliance and that it is able to offer up some lessons to friends back in Brussels from all 30 members? So over to you, and thanks again, Yoko, for joining us at such a late hour. We are very grateful, very grateful.
Yes, Julie, thanks for inviting me. I see something like 200 audience already, and I'm quite excited to be part of this. But it is actually 20 minutes past midnight, so you have to be kind to me. Right. About NATO-China review, it hasn't attracted that much attention here, I must say. So you need to do a better job in public relations if you want to be present here. Our relationship, especially with the UK and France, has been going pretty well, precisely because their Navy is now present in Indo-Pacific waters. We are a naval country. And we have always been sort of seagoing country, and that's how we see it. So, but this challenge that China is posing is both continental and maritime. So that requires a broader front than what we have been doing, especially in US-Japan alliance. It has been mainly maritime, I think, that we have been collaborating. Of course, we have had sort of scenarios of Soviet Union landing on Hokkaido and so on, but nobody really thought seriously about such a scenario materializing somewhere in the near future. Whereas China threat for us is there every day virtually. I mean, we see Chinese ships in our waters continuously. And so, you know, for us, the reaction is better late than never, actually. We've been waiting and we have been watching, and we've been, I think there's been a lot of interest in the EU reaction to China, partly because we have already have an established partnership, and we have already an FTA and so on, so that we're working in several programs and projects already, including the connectivity project. And we're quite aware of Chinese activities in Europe, and we have been curious about how Europe is going to react to that. I mean, you can't really force the partners to react in this way or that way. We can talk and communicate and try to influence, but not really, you can't force them to react in the way they don't want to. So last year has been pretty interesting. This year has been really, I think it has been a turning point in many ways. I mean, actually, you chose today. I mean, I'm already in the 24th of July, but you're still in 23rd. This was supposed to be the day when the Tokyo Olympic Games starts. It was today, and because of COVID-19, it's being rescheduled. I'm not quite sure if we're going to have it at all, but the China threat was also there in the last Tokyo Olympic, 1964. It was during this Olympic Games that China did its first nuclear weapons test. And it was very upsetting and disturbing and annoying for us, because this was a very peaceful fest that we are having, the Olympic Games, and right in the middle of that, China does its first nuclear weapons test. This year, it's something different, but we're also dealing with multitude of threats that for which China is partly responsible for. So, we all thought it's about time. And it's about time that we start talking, communicating about this problem. Maybe, can I just share our most recent defense white book that came out last week? How do I do
this? Please. Yeah, let's throw that up.
Wait a minute.
Give folks a chance to see it if you can share your screen briefly before we jump in.
Now?
Yes, we do.
So this is, I'm sorry it's in Japanese. It's not in the English Digest version yet. I think they're still working on the translation. But this is Beijing. And it shows how far the missiles from Beijing reaches. Right, so you have Washington here, New York here, Chicago, London, Paris, Moscow, New Delhi, Canberra, Hawaii. Okay, they're all the furthest that China's missiles can reach is virtually covers. I mean, even New Zealand is here, so it covers almost all the globe. So China is already a global problem, and here I have the estimate of number of Chinese missiles. I think that's rather a modest estimate. We had from RAND several years ago, that's 3 years ago, about the estimate of PLA missile threats to US bases in Western Pacific. And here you see in 2017 that virtually thousands of missiles can reach all the bases, American bases in Japan. Now, I'm not the one watching and counting, so I don't know which number you should rely on, but there is a problem. So, wait a minute, I'll come back to you now. So, and the Chinese did not like our defense white paper. They called it black paper. You might have heard about that. I do not wish another Cold War. I mean, I've studied Europe, I've studied Cold War, and it's not a nice period to be in. I was in Berlin when the Cold War ended, and it was such a relief to think that you don't have to worry about a global nuclear war every day, that it might be breaking off sometime and you could be anywhere. It was such a relief to be emancipated from that fear that was present every day. And I don't want to go back to that world, but we do have a problem. And so I think we need to start talking about it and start developing a coherent strategy about it. Thank you.
Great, thanks to all three of you. Well, because we have over 200 people dialing into this, and I'm being inundated with questions coming in through multiple channels here, I'm gonna just jump into the questions. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you a group of questions, and then you guys, I'll come back to each of you, pick and choose. You don't have to answer all of them, but maybe we can cover a lot of ground. I'll also combine some. So we've had quite a few questions come in on the subject of Russia. Some have noted, look, this is an alliance that is still working on enhancing deterrence and pushing back against Russian aggression, acts of intimidation, and the like. Russia has been hard enough. Shouldn't the alliance focus and stay focused on that challenge? Would a pivot to China detract from the alliance's ability to focus on Russia? And then a couple of questions along the lines of the Russia-China relationship, some noting that these two countries have moved ever closer together in a very strategic set of relationships, and whether or not enhancing cooperation with one or the other could break up that bond. Some advocating, as Macron has talked about, more engagement with Russia. Others saying, well, maybe if NATO enhances some outreach to China, that breaks off, leaves Russia more isolated. Anyways, Russia, 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 topic number one. Topic number two, some question about whether or not engagement with China could be more positive, that there could be one person submitted the question, should China be regarded purely as a rival warranting counteractions, countermeasures, or is there a scope for positive interactions in areas like global governance, connectivity, climate change, Africa, the Arctic, etc.? That's question two. Question three would be, outside of the United Kingdom and France, which was mentioned on a couple of occasions, Yoko mentioned Japan's relationship with those two countries because of their naval presence in the Indo-Pacific. Could this alliance actually project power in the Pacific? Is it capable? And what would you imagine a future role for Germany being in that regard? Was another question. And lastly, someone asked quite directly, what exactly does Japan want from the NATO Alliance? So those are a couple of things to gnaw on. Unfortunately, I will have to ask you to kind of, again, pick and choose, keep your answers relatively short so I can jump into another round of questions. But Ian, why don't I start with you? We'll kind of reverse the order a little bit. Ian, I'll let you jump in and then we'll go to Yoko.
Let me address I think the fourth question, which was what can Germany do? I'm going to take it as what can NATO do? And I think NATO can take a more forward-leaning posture to address kind of challenges that are posed by China. I think it's appropriate. I think that it can do that and also address its challenges from Russia. And quite frankly, I think in this world, we don't have a choice. When we have two adversaries that we're dealing with, we have to deal with two adversaries. To ignore one will leave us vulnerable to that one. So what can NATO do? I've got 5 specific actions. I'll be brief, Julie. 1, establish a NATO-China Council, something akin to the NATO-Russia Council. That would recognize and respond to the reality of China's growing influence and reach. I think it would usefully spur allies to comprehensively address in a coordinated way the challenges posed by Russia. It could also be a means by which to identify the challenges posed by China. It could also be a means to identify areas of potential collaboration between NATO and China, just in the same way the NATO-Russia Council is supposed to. Most importantly, it would underscore that great power competition is not between China and the United States, but between China and the transatlantic community, a community bound by shared values, interests, and history. So a NATO-China Council is in order. Second, the alliance should deepen its engagement with the specific partners. We have long-standing relationships with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Mongolia, Australia, but they've been largely consultative. And we ought to start broadening those relationships with more regular and more robust military exercises, particularly in the air, maritime, and soft domains, special operations forces domains. You could think of freedom of navigation exercises and operations. This wouldn't be something that dramatically new because a lot of the Europeans already participate in the US RIMPAC exercise. And as Fabrice pointed out, there are allies already who operate and have interests in the Indo-Pacific region. Third, we ought to establish a center of excellence in the Indo-Pacific region, maybe in one of the partners. If they're not ready for that, maybe in Honolulu. That would be a great way to start briefing up the alliance on what's happening in that region, enhancing its awareness and situational awareness and understanding of the regional and national dynamics in play. Fourth, I think now's the time to start integrating officers and NCOs from these key global partners in the Indo-Pacific region into the alliance's command structure to further enhance our understanding of each other. And I would even establish a small military headquarters in the Indo-Pacific region to help facilitate and coordinate these kind of NATO exercises and operations. You know, this is not a fold-the-gap remake in the Indo-Pacific. What it is I think, an appropriate response to ensuring that there's a NATO allied military dimension in what should be a transatlantic community's comprehensive response to the challenges and opportunities generated by China's emergence as a global power.
Terrific. Thanks for that, Ian. Yoko, I'm going to turn to you for any of the questions you'd like to take on.
Yes, thanks, Ian. I quite agree with your suggestions, and I actually had NATO-China Council on my notes that I prepared for this. We need to engage China in talks. You know, it's not just containing and lining up warships and so on. I mean, missile threat is one of the most urgent threat that we are feeling. Now, you're going to talk about intermediate missiles in Europe with Russians, but this will get nowhere without looking at the threat that China poses with their missiles. So you actually don't have a choice. The world, I mean, the front of the engagement is not in the middle of Europe. The Iron Curtain is gone, and it's, I don't know where it is. It's global, and Secretary General Stoltenberg has been talking about NATO's need to go global, and I really believe in it. So one other suggestion I can make is an Indo-Pacific Partnership Council, because you already have a Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council. One very important country that has not come up is India, right? They have a long established border with, and a long history of problems with China. And India is certainly a major player in the coming decades. And whatever we do with China, I think we need India's presence in the talks. And even for that purpose, I think some sort of an Indo-Pacific Partnership Council serves the purpose. Engagement with China is definitely necessary. I mean, we won't get anywhere with so many questions like environment, like health problems, without having China, but we need to do it differently, probably. I mean, what the US getting out of WHO doesn't really help. I will state it flatly. We need an international organization that deals with these problems, but we want it to be impartial and effective, which the WHO has not quite been in this crisis. So engagement with China, yes, but you know, China it's not a kind of power that will be nice to you when you're nice to them. So you have to have kind of a double approach that of sticks and carrots. You know, it will be nice to you if you can, you know, work with us in this problem, but the way you're behaving currently is not helping us. You know, we have to communicate strongly, and we have to show, you know, if you don't cooperate with us, we have our own agenda. And there we need to talk with each other, the Transatlantic Partnership and the Indo-Pacific world. So I think that's what we want from NATO. We need more dialogue, and we need to be aware and have common understanding of the problem. And we need a forum to sit together and discuss strategies about this.
Great, thank you. Fabrice, coming back to you.
Thanks a lot, Julie. Well, lots of things. So let me focus on a couple of those questions. On whether engagement can get us further with China than some sort of half engagement, half containment, because this is what we're talking about. I bet you this is a question coming from a European. And actually, that's kind of where my answer is. You know, nuances matter, and decoupling does not translate in European very well. And I think even though there is a meeting of the minds between Europe and the US on China as a challenge, which was not the case a few years ago, and I don't think any Europeans see eye to eye with the US administration currently. And the fact that a year ago when the EU published this kind of new approach, it contained 3 dimensions, like a triangle, characterizing China as a partner, China as a competitor, and China as a systemic rival. And this is a typical EU kind of consensus making impossible equilibrium recipe, but I think it translates very well the nuances in Europe and across capitals. You will indeed have some capitals who will be more hawkish, and I think, unfortunately, UK is out of the EU, but the UK remains European, and we can see the British government's position on China is hardening. But you will also have other capitals, especially Germany, in Berlin, where you were before, Julie, where there's still, I think, a strong belief that engagement, trade can help transform, not only do good for business, but help transform and put China on the right path. And I think that belief is still there, even though the EU has woken up and the EU has started building up a toolbox, and I'm happy to expand on that. So I think engagement is still running as an important aspect of a China strategy, but don't be naive. My firm, Rasmussen Global, I did a report on the EU strategy 1 year later, and a kind of audit on the 15 commitments that were taken in the EU strategy document. And actually where China receded most was on the cooperation global partner aspects, climate, Africa, debts, Iran, not just on the economic aspect where we have had problems of reciprocity, of technological intrusiveness and theft and so on, but it's actually also on the nicer diplomatic, feel-good basket. So I think that so far engagement, people still believe in it, but we are still far from engagement having produced much of a change. On the Russia dimension, it's a good question, and there are 2 questions in it. One is, oh yes, but NATO looking at China will detract us from the most immediate threat, which is Russia. And yes, there was this concern among some allies, and you can imagine which ones, that China review will take us away from the good stuff that has been done since 2015 when NATO started to kind of rebooting its deterrence posture. And actually, I would say actually, Poland is very ambivalent because Poland is very clear on the fact that Russia is a threat. But when you engage with Polish senior officials on China, they're much more ambivalent. But yet we're talking here about a communist regime, an oppressive regime. And I think Central Europe also has to kind of face its own contradictions on how tough it is on Russia and how ambivalent it is towards China. And so I think this is, the Russia factor is there, but I don't think we can talk of a distraction because NATO has still kept on, implementing its European posture vis-a-vis Russia. However, on the Russia-China connection, I don't buy the Macron notion that, if we manage to embrace Russia, we will manage to drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing. I think I don't know if it's naive or if it's tactical, but we know very well that Beijing and Moscow find their alliance very convenient and necessary. On the global diplomatic front, they're clearly triangulating when it comes to this UN Security Council, on also technological transfer, on energy trade. So they need each other, probably Russia more than China, and they find this relationship overly useful. And I don't see why Vladimir Putin will give up on that axis of convenience in order to embrace the kind of new sort of cooperation with the Europeans. Let me just challenge a couple of things. I always like to be with Ian on the same panel because I always like to hear what he says, and I always like to disagree with what he said. I think if anyone was seated in a NATO-Russia Council will tell you a NATO-China Council is definitely not a great idea, in the sense that this first, a NATO-Russia Council, it's the NATO allies plus Russia, all equal rights, equal say on the agenda. And this is what makes the operation and even the agenda setting of the council extremely difficult and painful. And listening to, Foreign Minister Lavrov for hours it can be a painful exercise. So I don't see that as a really productive. I think the Indo-Pacific Council, meaning with our like-minded partners, is something really needed, because our engagement with them has been too bilateral, too occasional, and now we need to go to the next level, similar to what we did with our non-NATO European partners in the Baltic, mostly Finland and Sweden, who are now almost de facto NATO members. We don't have yet a council for them, but it's planning, it's exercise, it's intel sharing, and I think if we were to get there in 10, 15 years by having something more structured, that would be a real good outcome. And then finally, I think it's important to mention that could NATO project power? I think on paper, yes, because of the United States. But in reality, as an alliance, when you see how difficult it is to just have a credible territorial defense posture in Europe itself, when you see how difficult it is to assure the mobility of NATO troops across the European territory, so I don't even want to think what that means across, several oceans and continents. So I think technically this would be very difficult, but it's not even a question that is asked, because politically I don't see the allies being there. For one reason, most European allies see the China question first and foremost an economic one. And therefore, and this is my last point to answer one of your earlier questions, the EU is the first responder here. And the EU has been building up its game, first by having an investment screening mechanism similar to CFIUS, less intrusive but still meaningful, and recently by tabling a new foreign subsidy instrument, which basically will bar Chinese state-subsidized companies from competing with European companies in the European single market. This is a pretty powerful tool from an economic point of view. And I think many in Europe see the European answer to China as mostly economic rather than a military security one.
Yes, Ian, go ahead.
Just quick, I love dealing with Fabrice because he always sharpens my thinking with his very often valid criticism. Just a couple points. One, I love the idea of an Indo-Pacific Council. I think, working with allies or partners, however we should call them, like-minded democracies, is always a good first step. So I just want to strongly endorse that. Second, I do think we need a forum for engagement with China directly. And yes, I've been through myself the painful process of the NATO-Russia Council, but ultimately I think it's sometimes a good herding mechanism within the alliance. Third quick point, in response to Fabrice's point about what would be the military impact of a NATO presence in the Indo-Pacific region. Would it be a decisive addition to the West's military posture in the region? Probably not. But what I'm talking about is ensuring that we have a fully integrated, comprehensive Western strategy, transatlantic strategy for dealing with this challenge. And so therefore, it would be useful geopolitically to have German ships, French ships, Italian aircraft at risk with the United States in that region. It's also a burden sharing issue. The Europeans can expect the United States to deploy brigades to defend its eastern frontier if it's not willing in this globalized world to stand with the United States in other theaters, including the Indo-Pacific. And then a fourth or last quick point, one thing to watch between Russia and China. Watch the synergy between what China is doing in the South China Sea and what Russia is trying to do in the Arctic. They're mutually reinforcing, and they're a direct challenge to the liberal international order and the rule-based protocols we want to abide by and to sustain. And what Russia is doing in the Arctic helps China in the South China Sea and vice versa. And the West needs a really coordinated response to both.
Thank you. All right. We have about 10 minutes left, and I've got about 1,000 questions myself and lots of other ones, but I'll try to limit it just to a couple. Maybe we'll do a bit of a lightning round here. Some questions from our listeners about what China wants in this relationship. I mean, it has been quite successful in enhancing its ties bilaterally with many members of the NATO Alliance, quite successfully, particularly in those southern tier countries, where it has a much more positive track record, more receptivity on the part of some of those southern European countries to relationships with China based on investment or other cooperative initiatives. So I guess the question here is, if we could settle on the question of a NATO-China Council, would there even be openness to that on the part of the Chinese? Some predictions on that. Question two, should we do more and have a more structured relationship between NATO and Japan? Does this relationship need an upgrade? Does it need to be more than occasional meetings with other partners? Should it specifically focus on this challenge in a much more structured way? Three, to Fabrice's point about mentioning that the EU is kind of, in the eyes of Europeans, the first responder to addressing some of the China challenge. I guess folks have been interested in understanding what are the prospects for more EU-NATO cooperation in this space, knowing, I think all of us know, the difficulties of getting these two organizations to come together, although we've made a lot of progress in recent years. But would this be an area for additional work? And then lastly, just some curiosity about anyone's take on this panel, on this reflection process that is underway right now, where a group of experts have been brought together, a group of outsiders, to think about kind of NATO's political cohesion and what steps can be taken on that front. Kind of what are your expectations for this reflection process as they relate to China, but also just more broadly? So with just a few minutes left to go, maybe we'll work in reverse order here. And Yoko, I'll start with you, and then we'll go just round out the panel here and close up.
Okay, thanks, Julie. That was a lot of questions.
Just one or two.
NATO, Japan. I've sat in lots of these dialogues, and they're nice, but they don't attract much attention. We need to step out into the spotlight. And Fabrice said that NATO has no major reach to the Far East, but I don't really believe that. We're not talking about making war plans with Italian ships and so on. No, we want to show that we are part of free and rule-based society, and that we value these rules and norms. And we want NATO countries to be here to show that to the Chinese and others. So you could be in South China Sea, you could be in Okinawa. We want to work together with you. Another thing we're doing is that to enhance the capability of other smaller countries in the region. Our institution, GRIPS, has a course where Coast Guards from Southeast Asia and also from India come to us and train with the Japanese Coast Guard for 1 year. And they also study international relations at our institute. You can be part of this, right? Doing capacity building for the other smaller nations along this Indo-Pacific world, who can, of course, sit in the Indo-Pacific Council, but there's a lot more we can do together. And you know, just a mutual visit or an exercise, search and rescue exercise together, that will send signals that we can do this together in our waters. It will send signals. So I really want them to be here, because we feel kind of alone. We only have the Americans to rely on. And well, can we really rely on them? That's a constant question. And it will definitely, I mean, it feels good to have the British and the French having interest in the South China Sea, and it will. And we have Canadian visits. We have had German Navy visits. So I'm sure there's Italian and French ships that are willing to come to our waters. And it will send political signals. The things are still political. It's not well, it's also military, but we're not expecting NATO countries to sort of beef up our defense posture. That's not what we're expecting. We can also talk more about interoperability and development of weapons. We've done that in F-35, and with our limited resources in the coming years, I think we need to do more of that. So that's another aspect we can examine. EU response has been welcome in Japan because it shows even in economic relationships, you need strategic thinking. And I think we want to see more of that. And we can work together on, especially you're going to go through a very difficult period with Brexit coming and all the turmoils associated with that. And we hope whoever it is, the next American government is more cooperative about free trade agreements and working together with international organizations. I think Europe and Japan shares definitely interest there, even to work with the WHO, although there might be people unhappy with how it's functioning. I mean, lots of these international organizations are not as effective as we want them to be, but all the more we need to engage in it and try to make it better. And NATO and Japan together, maybe with Australians and others, other ASEAN countries, we will be much stronger working together. Sorry, I spoke a lot.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you for those insights. Fabrice, why don't I go to you next?
Sorry, I was still on mute. Let me just pick three of your questions. One on what does China want? Because I think that's an important question. Two things. One is, I know that traditionally the Chinese government was quite reluctant to engage at a high level enough with NATO, very cautious on the dialogue and often referring back to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization saying, you are that kind of organization, you can plug with this, but us, this is more going to be bilateral with the big powers. So I guess things might have changed. I understand that the Deputy Secretary General of NATO has visited or is about to visit China, meeting the foreign minister, but as we know, the foreign minister is not necessarily where power lies in China. So I think there's still a long way to go. But on what it wants, if you look at the EU, I think it wants two things. It wants to look good. So it was very eager to get the EU to agree on the joint declaration at the last China-EU summit, which the EU refused because the Chinese were not willing to deliver. But they want to look good. They want to look like the good power, especially in the kind of COVID context. And at the same time, they want to carry on doing what they do in terms of economic practices, in terms of building up their posture in the Indo-Pacific. So it's, I think this is, I think if they see NATO as somehow fitting in that double strategy of we want good PR, but we don't want to change any of our practices, then they might be engaging. But beyond that, let's not be naive. And there's a real Chinese footprint in Brussels, which also raised concerns among services. And I think, the NATO-Russia Council has also been a source of issues in terms of intel exposure, given the staff that was at the Russian representation at the time. And I think we don't want to end up there again. So I think there should be a lot of caution on our engagement with China, even though it's important. On EU-NATO, absolutely, Julie. I think this should be a new chapter of the dialogue and coordination between both sides of Brussels, which I know from an American point of view sounds a bit absurd, but that somehow Brussels is, you have NATO and you have the EU, and the EU itself, the institutions are not always talking well to each other. But here I think it should be a new chapter. There should be discussing infrastructure, because some European infrastructures are now Chinese owned or partly owned, and they are critical infrastructure, including in possible, planning and military aspects. Investment, because some investments are done in civilian technology that can have dual use. And we have had example recently in Belgium, which can have actually consequences also in terms of the NATO capabilities, and all telecom and technology. And here, I think there should be much closer coordination, including between the investment screening activities of the European Commission and the NATO headquarters when they get information that there are some Chinese investment in some sectors that could be sensitive and problematic. Finally, on the expert group, I think we're not going to solve NATO's problem by going global. I think this would be a stretch. And look, NATO has been doing very well in terms of building up its posture. It's never enough, and there are always gaps, but I think we are in a much better place than we were 5 or 6 years ago. But I think now the real problems at the heart of NATO are at the heart of NATO. It's, some big allies who have big, significant disagreements. France, Turkey, US vis-a-vis the Europeans. And I think France is even probably considering what's the point? And maybe they're going to do a Sarkozy reverse. They're going to get out of the military structure. This is just me speculating. But I think there is a great fed-upness among some NATO European allies vis-a-vis an alliance that they don't see as coherent and making sense. So I think if I were to give the experts group a kind of roadmap for their work, they need to fix that. They need to focus on that and don't come up with gimmicks. Don't come up with big global strategy, but come up with a kind of core strategy that glue things back together.
Thank you for that. Wow, I hadn't thought of the reverse Sarkozy, so that may merit a whole, we may be calling you for another hour-long discussion just of that, but we should do something on the reflection process. All right, Ian, to closing comment.
I'll be quick, because I know you're over. On China's receptivity to a NATO-China Council, they won't like it. Why? Because it counters their strategy to divide and conquer within the transatlantic community. They don't like the idea of the allies standing together in one room. They'd rather deal with them separately. Separately is easy to divide. So I still would push. I think as the alliance takes a more assertive role in Indo-Pacific, China will recognize the benefits of actually engaging in such a council. On Japan and NATO, I loved Yoko's ideas. I'll just reiterate 2 of mine. Center of excellence. Have Japan stand up a center of excellence and more robust exercises. On NATO-EU cooperation, I hear Fabrice. I'm stunned. It's my impression that there has yet to be a joint meeting of NATO perm reps and EU ambassadors to discuss China. This just kind of underscores the kind of the absence of a comprehensive transatlantic strategy to deal with China. So that's a first step I would take, is bring those 2 chambers together and start talking about what are the opportunities and the challenges and risks and potentials we have in the transatlantic approach to China. And then on the reflection process, I'll just differ with Fabrice. I think China is going to be the key indicator whether or not the reflection process is itself reflective of where NATO is going. If NATO remains or tries to remain a regionally focused institution, it abandons the progress it's made as a global actor around the world, it will become an institution that's certainly less relevant to the United States. And so I think it's important for the reflection process to promote a Indo-China strategy, Indo-China posture for the alliance. Appropriate, not overwhelming, but appropriate and reinforcing to what could be a comprehensive transatlantic strategy that melds the West's political powers, economic powers, and its military powers together. So if the reflection process is going to stay regional, it's a bad sign for NATO. It should go big, it should go global, because that's where I think the future is for this alliance and for the transatlantic relationship. Thank you.
Well, that's terrific, and love having all of you here because I get a lot of different regional perspectives. We've had some disagreement, which is great. We've been able to get feedback and really good questions from all of our listeners and folks tuning in from all around the world. Really grateful to all three of you for taking the time, especially Yoko for in the middle of the night, essentially. We wish you a good night. We hope you will sleep well despite this crazy conversation. But it's given me lots of food for thought about additional events and programming that we can be doing at GMF with our partners on both sides of the Atlantic and in Asia. This is the heart of what the Asia program at GMF tries to do, to bring Europeans, Asians, and Americans together to talk about stuff like this. So couldn't be happier with this. Wish we had another hour. I'm sorry we don't. We'll call on you again. Wishing you a wonderful evening or afternoon or rest of your day, wherever you're tuning in from. And thanks again. Thanks to those joining us, and thanks to everybody on the screen. Take care, everybody.
Thank you,
Stay
Julie.
safe.
Thank you for having us.